If you're somebody like me with gray hairs and bad joints, then the game of basketball probably looks a little bit different than what you remember watching as a kid. It seemed like back then we had certified positions and everybody had a job based off of the height that they were given. Shorter guys typically were the floor setters. Then you had your longer athletic guys would play out on the wing, while the big guys sat down on the paint closest to the rim and would hit a couple post moves to score buckets. And as people will try to tell you that is completely gone from the game today. And on the surface, those people might actually be right, but when we take a deeper look, we can see that that's actually not the case. In order to fully grasp this, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of the NBA in like the 1950s, in an era that was completely dominated by a guy named Bob Cousy. Now, this guy had taken the NBA by storm. He was one of the most popular players because of his electric play style. He was super fast. He could handle the ball very well, or at least what would be conceived very well for the time. They had very strict dribbling rules. Hand literally couldn't leave the top of the basketball. He was phenomenal at setting his team up. However, he wasn't able to ever grasp a championship until the Boston Celtics decided to just completely change the game. Their head coach, Red Auerbach, decided that he was going to implement something called the fast break offense. And now with center Bill Russell, who didn't really care about scoring, as their defensive anchor, the team was able to just go flying up the court after Bill Russell would give blocks, and it allowed Bob Cousy to use his best trait, his passing ability, to get everybody on his team involved to the point that the Celtics were so dominant that they won a championship Bill Russell's rookie year, went to the finals his sophomore year, lost there, and then won 5 straight rings before Bob Cousy retired. Now, the thing we know about the league is that this is a copycat league. So the NBA just watched Bob Cousy win 6 rings with this pass-first point guard style and decided that's what a point guard needs to be. And they all went on the hunt for the next Bob Cousy. And while we saw some phenomenal pass-first guards and some who found a lot of individual success but not as much team success, it would be 16 years before we would find a guy who could do all of that together. And that's when Magic Johnson would take the torch from Bob Cousy and take what he did to a superstar level, which is only fitting that his name would be Magic Johnson, considering Bob Cousy's nickname was Houdini. And now here is where we find the Lakers building pretty much a more modern version of what the Boston Celtics had, a team that thrives off of fast breaks with a phenomenal floor setting point guard. And even though the league had drastically improved from what it was back in the 50s and 60s, the Lakers still found a way to go to 8 NBA finals in the 1980s alone. But what Magic Johnson did was just as important as what Bob Cousy did, because Magic showed a new style of the traditional pass-first point guard. He showed that guys who are taller don't have to be boxed into one position, and they can also be floor generals. The same way that Bob Cousy showed that if you're smaller, maybe the best way to have success is to find your guys in open spots and use them as tools. But you can't find a 6'9" guy with elite court vision just anywhere. So teams went back to finding the smaller, traditional point guard, and that's what brought us to John Stockton in the 90s. A guy who has had a very dominant run in the West, going to 2 NBA finals with his 1-2 punch with he who shall not be named. John Stockton was essentially, if you took Bob Cousy, modernized his game a little bit, dropped him in the 80s and 90s, that's what you would have got. The issue is, after Magic, we really don't see this traditional point guards have the same level of success and star power, because that's when this guy comes in named Michael Jordan, who shows just how dominant a scoring wing can be. And that's really where the issue of the death of the traditional point guard began, because everybody wanted to be like Mike. You can go on Twitter right now, and I promise you, there are at least 100 people talking about what Michael Jordan used to do is being done on a nightly basis in the NBA, and that is for a reason. It's because the league realized how much more exciting it is to watch one of those tall athletic wings dominate the ball and be your go-to scorer. Not to mention, with all the kids who grew up watching Michael Jordan play, they start copying all his moves. We keep seeing different mini versions of that same player, the same way we saw with Bob Cousy. So now these guys who were coming up replicating Bob Cousy and Magic Johnson's flashy passes are trying to replicate Jordan's signature fadeaway. But the guy happened to stop growing at 6 foot, which birthed us to Allen Iverson, the Stephon Marburys, the guys who are shorter and score like a 2 guard but are put at the 1 just solely based off of their height. The same way Bob Cousy was the blueprint for the pass-first point guard, these are the guys who are the blueprint for the modern guards that we have today. However, while these guys were excited in the youth, Jason Kidd was headed to back-to-back finals. Chris Paul was coming into the league and being revered as one of the best point guards we had seen since Magic Johnson. Heck, Steve Nash is looking like somebody dropped Bob Cousy in the early 2000s and gave him a jump shot on his way to win back-to-back MVPs. Yes, the score-first point guard begins to rise here. The pass-first point guard is still very much a very viable skill set to have. As a matter of fact, in this wing-dominant, weak center era of basketball, a pass-first point guard is essentially the best thing you could be. A guy who forces the bigs to not have to make post moves, but they can score off of the pick and roll. A guy who's able to direct traffic so that the wings can get open. But what happens when you find a player who wants to do both? I mean, at this point, the stretch big is starting to become more of a thing. Guys want to follow after Dirk. No player wants to be only a pass-first guard like Jason Kidd and end up with a nickname like Ace and Kidd of their own. Chris Paul is already showcasing that you can be a pass-first point guard while scoring, but what if scoring became your true option? What if the offense revolved around a smaller guy who could score at will, dominate inside against these weaker bigs due to his elite level athleticism, and also keep his teammates involved and knock down jumpers? Well, that guy would just be Derrick Rose. Well, him and Russell Westbrook are both actually very important for what we got from the modern guard, because these were guys who would ferociously attack the defense, forcing you to have to guard them. And once you have to guard them, they would create for their teammates based off of their scoring ability. They took what made a pass-first guard great and what made a scoring guard great and combined those into two things, which honestly was the perfect solution to the problem that guys like Rondo had, where if you weren't necessarily a scoring threat, teams just stopped guarding you. They just left you wide open to shoot. And although neither of these guys had magnificent jumpers, teams couldn't leave them open because they would literally just straight attack the defense. Once they got their foot in the paint, the big stepped over, easy dunk. It was honestly a beautiful playstyle that the league heavily chased. If you were a smaller guard who was lightning fast, could handle the rock, and facilitate the other guys based off of your athleticism, there's a high market value for that. The issue started to arise when we started to see the wear and tear that this led on guys' bodies. We saw Derrick Rose break down. We saw Russell Westbrook suffer a couple injuries, despite the fact he's not human, was able to bounce back. And we even saw it sort of derail guys like John Wall's career. You know, this is what the league thought worked. We didn't really think that there could be anything else to come after this. Yeah, the athletic guys kind of suffer once they get a few injuries up under their belt, but they're still very productive during their prime years. And it looked like with Russell Westbrook's early finals appearance and Derrick Rose being able to the youngest MVP award in the history of the NBA, that maybe this is just how guys would play. Until one man decided to change all of that. Stephen Curry completely changed the way that we look at point guards. He started shooting all of these long-range threes, opening up the game. Instead of dominating with athleticism like we saw from the guys before him, he decided that since he wasn't athletic enough, he was going to use his insanely high skill level to open up the game for him and for his teammates. And what that did is something that we hadn't seen in the league before. Usually we was used to having to collapse the paint to try and push guys outward. But with him, he was stretching the floor at a rate that was just so unbelievable that no matter whether he had the ball in his hand or without it, he was dangerous. And the reason this was able to work is because back in 2003, there was a guy named LeBron James who was drafted straight out of high school. And this man was essentially Magic Johnson with Michael Jordan's athleticism. And he, like Magic Johnson, revolutionized the way that people looked at the game of basketball. There had been point forwards before him, but there hadn't been a guy since Magic who had the size and basketball IQ that LeBron possessed. Now, when you couple that with the fact that he didn't actually play point guard as his position, he played with other point guards, it allowed for something that people hadn't really considered, and that was the floor general to not necessarily be the point guard. So with this being the standard, it allowed the Warriors to run a lot of DHO, dribble handoffs, with Draymond Green and Steph Curry being the off-ball playmaker. Because while Steph could his own offense the same way that Derrick Rose or Russell Westbrook could, he took this a step further by playing off the ball, forcing the defense to always have to worry about where Curry's at the same way you would a sharpshooter, making him one of the most dominant players of his generation. And dominant is usually a term that's reserved for guys who are more physically imposing. He is quite literally the smallest dominant player we have ever seen in the league. So because of that, and because it's a copycat league, teams decided, what if we took our best offensive player and put them as a point guard and let them try and develop their own playmaking ability? And that led to James Harden, who was a natural two guard, who was coming off the bench for the Oklahoma City Thunder, getting moved to point guard with the Houston Rockets, and learning how to develop as a playmaker, completely changing the way that the game is played forever. Because after James Harden, we eventually got guys like Luka, who in the past would have probably played the 2 or the 3. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, another 2-time MVP, who in the past would have had to play the 2, is now playing point guard. And we even saw the Suns try and do it with Devin Booker, where everybody took the idea of maybe if we give our best offensive player the ball in his hands and let him create the offense on his own, we could have our own version of what James Harden did, which was his version of what Steph Curry did, and so on and so forth. It's just a continuation of what the past generations of point guard have evolved to. But throughout all of that, the traditional pass-first point guard has also always stood the test of time. Throughout the league, we have seen guys like Lonzo Ball be really successful before the injuries took over, and Tyrese Halliburton, even as a pass-first point guard, the most traditional way possible, led his team to a Game 7 in the NBA Finals before getting injured. The play style has always existed. It will probably always stand the test of the time, just because if you're one of the guys who can make those around you better, there's always going to be a place for you in the league. But over time, as the game popularizes, as guys start to do new things, trends start to change, new play styles tend to evolve. Now we have guys like Jokic, who are essentially point center, something that we really hadn't seen too much of in the league, where his team doesn't even have a traditional point guard of any sense. They put Jamal Murray, who's a 2 guard, at the point and let Jokic do most of the playmaking. Shows that the pass-first point guard never disappeared. The position just kept expanding until point guards stopped describing one specific way to play. Now we reached the point where sometimes the best point guard on the floor isn't even a point guard at all. Because when you have guys like Jokic essentially playing point center, then that's an entirely different evolution. Probably another story for a different day.